2.5 billion years from the present. At this point in our journey, we've already covered 2 billion years of our planet's past, and we're now nearly halfway finished. Up until this point, Earth had been unrecognizable, going from a scorching ball of molten magma to a strange green world filled with life forms whose origins are still shrouded in mystery. As we dive into the third and longest eon of Earth's history, the Proterozoic, things will slowly begin to look more familiar. The Proterozoic lasted from around 2.5 billion to 538 million years ago and is divided into 3 eras, the Paleo, Meso, and Neo-Proterozoic. This video will specifically cover its first era, and I'll cover the rest in future videos. The Paleoproterozoic is currently the longest era in geologic history, lasting from 2.5 to 1.6 billion years ago, being longer than the entire Phanerozoic eon and almost all of the Neo-Proterozoic combined. Unlike the previous eras from the Archean, the Paleoproterozoic is also further divided into 4 time periods: the Siderian, Rhyachian, Orosirian, and Siderian. We have about 900 million years to cover, so sit back as we begin to see a turning point in Earth's history. At the dawn of the Proterozoic, during the Siderian Period, cyanobacteria would have continued their reign they've established in the Archean, feeding off the sun's rays along with carbon dioxide and water in order to obtain energy. In doing so, they would have produced a waste product that you may be familiar with: oxygen. While it may be hard to imagine today, Earth was completely devoid of oxygen up until this point. 2.5 billion years ago, the atmosphere would have consisted primarily of methane and carbon dioxide, and the skies would have been orange as opposed to blue. This is the world life I've been accustomed to for over a billion years. But this will all soon change, however. As these photosynthetic organisms continue pumping out this byproduct, they'll soon cause massive, deadly consequences on the entire planet. Throughout the Archean and into the Siderian, Earth's oceans would have had a much higher concentration in iron, which resulted in the oceans being green. When oxygen came into play, it would have dissolved the iron to create iron oxide, which ended up forming deposits on the ocean floor. These are known today as banded iron formations, named as such for their intricate patterns of magnetae and chalcedony, reflecting the constant rise and fall of oxygen levels throughout the cyanobacteria's reign. While these formations first appeared early within the Archean, the Siderian is when they were at their most abundant. That's actually how the period got its name, meaning iron. If you know anything about chemistry, you should know that when iron interacts with oxygen, it becomes oxidized, also known as rust, turning it into a reddish-brown color. The higher concentration of iron in the oceans, along with the steady rise in oxygen, ultimately caused the seas to, in a way, rust themselves, turning them from a rich green color to a dark bloody red over the span of the time period. This transformation ultimately marked a turning point, as soon more oxygen was being produced and the minerals had time to bond with, thus enabling oxygen to spread across the entire planet and to cause what might have been the greatest catastrophe life had ever faced. Throughout the Archean and early into the Siderian, nearly all organisms were anaerobic. In other words, they were able to survive without oxygen. In fact, oxygen is actually toxic to them, as the element is highly reactive and it can thus interfere with their cellular structure. As photosynthetic organisms continued to pump out oxygen, the entire ocean soon became oxidized, killing off entire colonies of anaerobic life that had existed for hundreds of millions of years before. By halfway through the Siderian, 2.4 billion years ago, an estimated 99% of life had perished in what has come to be known as the Great Oxidation Event. But things are about to get much worse. During the oxygen catastrophe, oxygen also began to build up in the atmosphere, converting most of the methane, a greenhouse gas, into much weaker CO2, which was then further absorbed by cyanobacteria to produce even more oxygen. With the amount of greenhouse gases being heavily reduced, in addition to the lack of volcanic activity, global temperatures began to drop rapidly, and soon the entire planet froze. Throughout the rest of the Siderian and into the following period, the Rhyachian, the entire planet, save for maybe some small patches within the equator, were completely covered in ice sheets. This was Earth's first and by far biggest ice age, the Huronian glaciation. Within the depths, however, life continues to persist on, evolving new adaptations to cope with the ever-changing world. During the Great Oxidation event and the glaciation that followed, some organisms managed to take advantage of the new, abundant oxygen by utilizing it for respiration. Oxygen is a highly reactive element, and thus makes it the perfect electron acceptor to generate energy during the breakdown of nutrients. These organisms ultimately became aerobic, and they will go on to evolve into all complex life today. As for the remaining anaerobic life, they secluded themselves to the deepest depths of the ocean where oxygen can't reach, and this is where most of them remain to this day. Earth will continue to remain frozen for the next 300 million years, until eventually the ice melted as a result of the active volcanism in this period, thus producing large amounts of CO2 back into the atmosphere. During the next stage of the Paleoproterozoic, the Orosirian, the long-term effects of the Great Oxidation event had become highly apparent. The atmosphere, once a rich orange hue, had now transformed into the rich blue skies we're familiar with today. Meanwhile, the oceans would have turned clear as most of the iron would have been completely dissolved at this point, bringing an end to the production of banded iron formations. The Orosirian was named for the extensive mountain building that would have occurred at the time, and towards the end of the period, the continents would have collided together to create the supercontinent Columbia, also known as Nuna. Of course, the planet itself wasn't the only thing that had gone through some changes, as by around this time, a new form of life had evolved. Enter the eukaryotes. Today, eukaryotes consist of all multicellular life, including plants, animals, and fungi. They're a lot more complex than the more primitive prokaryotes, being much larger in addition to having various organelles that help perform more complex tasks. While their exact origins are poorly understood, we still have a general idea of their evolution thanks to a theory called the endosymbiosis theory. The theory suggests that at some point during the Paleoproterozoic, small anaerobic bacteria would have been engulfed by much larger bacteria, yet they wouldn't have been digested. Instead, they would have provided energy for the larger cell, which in turn provided the anaerobic cell protection from outside forces. These small bacteria eventually evolved into the mitochondria, the so-called powerhouse of the cell, and other organelles may have had similar origins. In some cases, photosynthetic cyanobacteria would have been engulfed as well, eventually evolving into chloroplast. These organisms will eventually go on to evolve into plants. There is actually very strong evidence supporting the endosymbiosis theory, as not only do both mitochondria and chloroplasts bear a striking resemblance to prokaryotic bacteria, but DNA analysis reveals that they have their own set of genes, completely separate from the rest of the cell. While there's still so much to learn about their origins, eukaryotes were, without a doubt, a major evolutionary accomplishment of life on Earth, and which will further lead to more complex organisms in the following hundreds of millions of years. By the time the Siderian came into play 1.8 billion years ago, things start to slow down. We've now entered what is referred to as the boring billion, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Geologic activity was minimal, and evolution appeared to have had a stalemate. Not only is this an ironic way to conclude an otherwise very chaotic era of the Proterozoic, but it also serves as a perfect transition to the next installment, where we'll look through what may have been Earth's most boring era, the Mesoproterozoic. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.